It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to a new Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week, we need to check in on our neighbors at 10 Cloverfield Lane. Now, here's a thing that might sound maybe be a bit of a surprise for the guy who has a show called Monster Mondays that has often featured Godzilla and Gamera and other giant monsters, but I did not really like the 2008 film Cloverfield. In order to talk about 10 Cloverfield Lane, the spiritual sequel, and I guess really technically a little bit more of a direct sequel than the original, we do need to talk about that 2008 original. Now, back in 2007, these somewhat interesting trailers started showing up online and in theaters, and in them, we see people having a party on a New York City apartment roof. There's some commotion, and suddenly we see the head of the Statue of Liberty as if it was flung, and it begins to roll to a stop on the street below. Now, there was at least somewhat clearly a found footage style horror film as inspired by things like the Blair Witch Project at play here. And it would seem as though what caused the terror was probably an animal, but I think some people wondered if it was maybe an alien invasion or maybe a little bit of both. And it was a fairly well-kept secret as to what the creature actually was. In fact, the monster was really kind of rarely even seen as a whole in the movie. You see it moving between buildings, or you see its tail, and you just see bits and pieces of it as the movie continued. Now, the best thing about the movie was the creature's offspring that would, kind of deal with people on a more one-on-one level, while the giant mama creature was laying waste to the city. There is something of, I guess, a sad ending where none of the characters that we were following throughout the movie seemingly surviving. But the first film had two main issues. First, it was one of those scenarios where the style of being a found footage movie creates an issue where you need to ask, why are people still filming? Why aren't they putting away their cameras? I mean, that can be really jarring for an entire movie if you have to constantly wonder why the camera is still running, or why it's not being put down so that these people can easily run to safety and so forth. Second, the characters were never really likable to me. Sure, in a situation like a giant monster coming after you, you might find yourself being a little bit of being in kind of a fairly crappy mood. Sure. And sure, we're kind of meeting these people in the middle of a party where they are saying goodbye to a friend. But while that does do something interesting for realism, it's still subject to my criticism of the characters that I'm stuck with for a full 85 minutes. However, big names were behind Cloverfield. These included J.J. Abrams, who was just about to explode onto the scene and be just about everywhere you turn your head, as far as films were concerned. He wrote and directed Mission Impossible 3 in 2006. Yeah, he was successful on TV. He did Felicity. He did shows that were popular before that, but unless you were watching those TV shows, you didn't really know J.J. Abrams until he started really kind of hitting big in these movies. Like I said, a couple of years before Cloverfield, he did Mission Impossible 3. He was about to make Star Trek, and he would, of course, eventually land in the Star Wars universe with mixed results. Regardless, he was on the verge of seemingly being a kind of new Steven Spielberg. So he co-produced Cloverfield, and it was directed by Matt Reeves. Now, Reeves would make a huge name for himself with 2014's Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and 2017 with War for the Planet of the Apes, and then just last year with 2022's The Batman. Now, I may not really like Cloverfield, but I like Matt Reeves a lot for those three films alone. And if I could wax somewhat poetic here, between Matt Reeves, J.J. Abrams, and the first Cloverfield movie, I have to think that they should take some real positive credit and responsibility for giving us the movies that would later come along in the monsterverse, like Godzilla, Kong Skull Island, and so forth. Giant monster movies weren't really an American thing. 1998's Godzilla proved that all to hell. However, after Cloverfield, a lot of young directors were chomping at the bit to make giant monster movies. I covered 2010's Monster previously, and that was clearly inspired by the same idea. It was almost like minimalist giant monster movie, and that really worked for American audiences. Say whatever you want about 2014's Godzilla film, it was a massive hit and launched a franchise that is still alive today, but also used a much more minimalist approach to the monsters as far as when we see them, how much we see them, how they're treated, and so forth. So now, let's fast forward to 2016 and the movie that will be the focus of this week's episode, 10 Cloverfield Lane. This movie was not originally a Cloverfield sequel. In fact, no sequels were really being planned at all for the 2008 film. However, this came from what is called a spec script. Now, these are scripts written by people hoping to get them optioned and or sold to producers, and basically these are unsolicited. It became something quite impressive to people, so Paramount came along and bought it, and J.J. Abrams' Bad Robot Productions began developing the script further. And that's when it eventually became an even more minimalist monster movie that we know as 10 Cloverfield Lane. Now, what makes this a movie that I particularly liked, and I'll talk a lot more about it later, is that it almost feels inspired by George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, or probably more accurately, Night of the Living Dead, but with an even smaller cast. There's something going on outside. We don't really know too much about what that something is, or at least what the state of the world is, or what caused it, but there's a bunker our characters are holed up in. And like I said, I'll talk a lot more about this, but it's a great setup for psychological drama and thriller flicks like this one. The marketing for this movie was also pretty interesting. This movie did not reveal its title until just days before Abrams released his Star Wars The Force Awakens, which was only about 3 months before the release of this movie. And so it led to a lot of viral marketing, kind of mirroring the first film's marketing. And what we were shown in the trailer was a trio of people in a bunker with Tommy James and the Shondells, I Think We're Alone Now, playing. Things seem fairly happy. We have 2 younger people, and hey, that's John Goodman. Is he their father? Is he one of the others' fathers? And the other person is a spouse to that person. Why are they in a bunker? This is kind of interesting. But things turn fast in the trailer. It's a great trailer, and what's more, is that Mary Elizabeth Winstead is the lady in the movie, and she won my heart over as Ramona Flowers in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. And so what a great way to make sure I buy a ticket to this movie. Right, so there's a lot to talk about this movie for being such a small story and plot, so we need to get into this and talk about this, how this ultra low budget movie and very minimalist movie became a heck of a tense film. The movie opens in a city where Michelle, played by Winstead, is frantically packing her things and leaving her fiancé. She drives through a remote patch of rural Louisiana on her way to New Orleans. As night falls, she turns on her radio, where we learn a little bit about a catastrophic power surge that wiped out power to most of the southern United States seaboard. Then, unexpectedly, her car is hit by another and thrown off the road. She wakes up bloodied, but is provided an IV for fluids, and her badly injured leg or knee is at least in a brace. But most unnerving is that she's handcuffed and essentially chained to a wall in this pretty not great looking, almost like it's a dungeon in this bunker that she's waking up in. Now, a seemingly friendly man named Howard, played by John Goodman, enters. And he's large, imposing, and has a gun, but he also has food for her. And she begs not to be hurt and allowed to leave, but he explains that she was in shock when he found her, but he's going to help keep her alive and gives her a pair of crutches. Even though he gives her the key to the cuffs that's keeping her restrained, he's not exactly the most personable guy and tells her that basically, in no uncertain terms, no one is looking for her. And after he leaves her alone, she fashions something of a stake from the end of one of the crutches and sets a trap to try to ambush him and get out. But, well, he's rather large and is basically able to quickly overpower her, and he uses a tranquilizer to knock her out again. When she wakes up, he tells her that there isn't really any place for her to go. Shortly after her accident, there was a big attack. He doesn't know exactly the nature of the attack, but they are safe in the bunker under his farm, which is about 40 miles outside of St. Charles. She still wants to go, but he explains the attack means that there is a fallout. And if it's a weapon that they know about, it might be a year or two before they can leave. But he also says that Russians are making nasty stuff, and if the Martians finally figured out how to get to Earth, their stuff will make the Russian stuff look pretty weak. Okay. But anyway, she wants to call her family. He says that everyone outside the bunker is dead. Now, there is one other person in the bunker that she hears kind of dropping something, but she doesn't see. Howard leaves her room and yells at the other unseen person and comes back in with a message. She, like he told the other guy there, needs to eat, she needs to sleep, and she needs to start showing him the appropriate appreciation for saving her life. That other person is Emmett. Now, he's been there for what he says is a couple of days. He also seems to be injured. That injury, as explained by Howard, was something he did himself by stumbling around and knocking over shelves of food and so forth. But Howard shows her around the place. Now, aside from having no windows, it does look relatively cozy. He's got a TV, he's got a VCR, he's got a DVD player, he's got movies. There's a whole system that keeps the air clean and nice for the inhabitants. He also shows her Frank and Mildred, and they are two pigs outside on the farm who are decomposing, presumably due to a chemical fallout from the attack. Emmett was hired by Howard at some point in the past to help build this bunker. So he knows a little bit about Howard, and that Howard is indeed a conspiracy theorist. He also knows that, according to Howard, he worked in the Navy on satellite stuff. Emmett was not captured like Michelle was. Emmett tried to get into the shelter, and Michelle recognized Howard's truck as being the one that knocked her off the road. So she thinks all of what she's being told is crap. But Emmett says that he saw the initial attack himself. He saw a flash of light unlike anything he had ever seen before in the sky, and knowing about the bunker, he went straight to Howard's farm. And he got there just before Howard shut the door and had to kind of basically fight his way into the shelter, which explains his injuries. But Michelle contends that since she was here, she heard cars driving directly over the bunker. She simply does not believe the story about the contamination in the air. At dinner, Howard notices that Emmett and Michelle are getting along. When Emmett makes a joke, Howard doesn't care much for Michelle's chuckle, and he really doesn't care much for Emmett continuing to crack jokes and how Michelle seems to really only speak to him. In a confrontation over his dinner, or over this dinner conversation, Michelle does snag Howard's keys to try to escape, and uses a sound overhead to basically smash him in the head with a beer bottle and try to get out the door of the bunker. And looking through the door's window, she sees a car and a woman with what looks to be like burns on her face or lesions, begs to be brought inside, but Howard tells Michelle not to let her in. Michelle, despite the pleas and the insults from the woman, backs away and goes back into the bunker, leaving the woman outside to die. Howard admits to crashing into Michelle's car because he was driving like a maniac after finding out about the attack, and he does apologize. He then asks her to stitch the cut that she gave him on his forehead by smashing the bottle on his head. And with seeing the neighbor's condition and Howard being a little less of a nutcase, at least by talking about his past, talking about having a daughter named Megan, things start to settle down and the trio start to settle into their new life in the bunker. And after a long period of no real weirdness, the bunker begins to shudder. And Howard says the satellite he set up picked up increased signals that he thinks are extraterrestrial. Basically, he surmises the aliens bombed the place out and then sent in ground forces to basically finish off any remaining living humans. Michelle needs to go and restart the air filtration system that has also shut down due to this shuddering, and discovers a horrifying sight. In a window facing upward, on the hatch, is the word "help" scratched into the window with some blood. And Michelle finds an earring that appears to have been the thing that was used to scratch the message into the window, and matches it to the one in a photo Howard showed her of his supposed daughter Megan. However, it's not Megan. It's a girl that went missing a couple of years ago that Emmett went to school with. And it's rather clear that Howard is hiding a lot of very bad stuff. Michelle devises a way with the plastic shower curtain to make a suit that she can use to get outside. She works on that as Emmett builds a breathable mask to filter air. However, Howard gets wise to some of the shenanigans going on with some tools that he found laying out. So he shows the pair a barrel of acid and basically threatens them to tell them what's going on. Emmett says that he was trying to build a weapon so that he can get Howard's gun so that Michelle would respect him like she does the elder. He apologizes, but despite accepting the apology, Howard shoots Emmett in the face and kills him right in front of Michelle. With things getting much more out of hand, Michelle works harder to finish the suit to get out. And when Howard figures out that she's hiding something, she dumps the acid barrel, which he falls into, and it disfigures him while also starting a fire in the bunker. She barely escapes and puts on her suit to get out through the air filtration hatch, and she uses compressed liquid nitrogen to break the padlock on the door, which is something that she learned about from Howard earlier in the movie. When she gets outside, she sees things are relatively calm and almost serene. She accidentally rips her suit and frantically tries to seal the tear, but soon realizes that birds are flying overhead, proving that the air quality is not dangerous. She takes off her mask and then the suit, and hears all sorts of life outside with like birds chirping and bugs doing bug things and so on. She looks out onto the horizon to see what's going on, and she does see a strange thing flying in the sky, but then she's distracted by the bunker exploding. That attracts the alien spaceship flying overhead, and it drops something into the field at the farm, forcing Michelle to basically try to use one of the vehicles to escape, but she's forced to hide in the shed from that little alien monster that is trying to hunt her down. And she tries getting in Howard's truck to save herself, but it is basically picked up by the giant flying monster, or the ship that is kind of part ship, part monster. And it's going to basically try to eat her until she finds the bottle of scotch that she took from her apartment at the beginning of the movie and a lighter. She uses it to make a Molotov cocktail and throws that into the beastie's mouth, and it explodes. She gets into the lady's car who tried to get into the shelter earlier in the movie and drives off. And as she does this, humanity is battling the alien monsters off in the distance, as the radio reports that people in Houston need help, but that people are winning the battle against the invasion. Michelle turns towards Houston to help in the fight. Now let's get to the three things that I like about 10 Cloverfield Lane. First up, I mentioned that this feels a little bit like Romero's Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, and that's because this is far more of a character study. You have an older generation guy whose whole thing is being prepared, and you have two younger people dealing with regrets of running away when things got bad. Now, they are here in this bunker. Emmett is basically the guy in the middle, a kid who got scared of his potential and stayed mediocre. Michelle runs when things get tough, as we saw at the beginning, with her and her boyfriend getting into a fight, and then she basically threw it all away because she didn't know how to fix the damage. Meanwhile, Howard had bad stuff in his life. I do believe that his wife and his daughter Megan left him. And he turned everything inward and stood his ground and insulated himself and tried to basically recreate that family that he had. It's a great example of how a movie with only three characters can be really fascinating and engaging. And what's more is that there are things set up in this script and in this movie that pay off later. The liquid nitrogen, Howard uses it to cool off drinks. He talked about how he used it to freeze the door lock and break off the handle. So when his CO in the Navy got to be a little bit too much of a problem for him and the rest of the crew, they would lock him in bathrooms and stuff doing that. So she learned how to use that basically to get out. Also, the green acid stuff. There was an air quality issue, but what it was that it was basically a vaporized version of that acid, and that's what led to the neighbor lady having those lesions and those marks on her face. It is something that does kill people, and it is something that's used almost like bug spray by the aliens to get rid of people. But it is very clearly a green gas that mirrors the green liquid of the acid that ultimately ends up becoming not only Emmett's fate, but also what causes the bunker to explode. So it's a really well-constructed movie, and it never gets slow, even though it is slowly paced. It is a slow burn for this movie. But there's always danger just in the other room of this bunker. And it's really, really well put together, constructed, things that get put into it that pay off later. It's a great example of good writing and really engaging writing. Now, second, I really like that time really means almost nothing in this movie. This is a bunker with very few windows, and everything is entirely artificial and simulated. You sleep when you're tired, but you don't have that internal clock that tires you out because you see the sun go down or wakes you up when you see the sun come up. We don't see any daytime or nighttime like normal people would. So when we first meet Emmett, when Michelle does, he even says he doesn't really know how long he's been there. He thought it's been a couple of days, but it might have been longer. However, there is a nice little clue that we're given about how much time passes, and that's Michelle's fingernails. At the start of the movie, when she's collecting things, we're watching her hands gather stuff, pack it into her bag, grabbing her phone, answering her phone when she's in her car, and so forth. Her black nail polish is covering all of her nails evenly. It's almost like it's been freshly done, but as the movie progresses, that nail polish gets worn away and starts to chip away. So we know that there's been some time. It's possibly been weeks that they've been here. I'm going to circle back around to this in just a moment. But thirdly, John Goodman is fantastic in this movie. He's obviously a weirdo. We know this from the very first line he speaks in the movie. Some of his lines on the surface are, if not friendly, not exactly threatening. He talks about wanting to keep Michelle alive. He seemingly has some knowledge on how to treat her wounds and use IVs and so forth. However, his delivery is always threatening and menacing. He's exceptionally particular. She is to show him respect. everyone must use coasters on the table because it's a family heirloom. If they watch a movie, fine by him, but God damn it, put the movies back into their sleeves properly. He talks about Russians and Martians. He's a doomsday prepper. He's clearly deranged in some way. Maybe he's not exactly physically violent at first, but he had a Megan, a daughter, who is not here anymore, and he's clearly bothered by it. He's the personification of all the weird traits someone that ultimately comes off very unsettling would possess. He treats Michelle and Emmett like he's a domineering father, but also wants Michelle to either remain chaste or show him appreciation by possibly other means. He talks about how his ex-wife turned Megan against him and then they left for Chicago. It's very possible that he did some very unsightly things to his own daughter, and he continues to do that to these other women that he's interacted with. He's clearly had another woman in that bunker before Michelle. And at one point, they are playing a word game, and he cannot even use the word woman to describe Michelle. So it's this game where Emmett is trying to basically use clues to get the right answer. And he says that Michelle is one of these, meaning woman. The first word was little, so the answer is little women. So he's trying to basically say, okay, what is Michelle? She's a woman. And Howard responds by saying, she's a girl. And then he's like, no, what's another word for that? And he's like, girl, little princess. It's a weird and uncomfortable thing. I mean, it's such a weird thing. He's such a weird guy. He's a scary guy. And Goodman is great in this role, especially after we've so often seen John Goodman as a guy that we often like in movies. Now, one more thing I do want to say that tie those last two things I've talked about together, the nail polish and the passage of time and so on. But Michelle's worn away and chipped nail polish makes me think back to when I was a kid. And the girls that I went to elementary and middle school with who would paint their nails, but then they would let it wear away instead of simply removing it with like nail polish remover and redoing them. Sometimes they would just paint right over them. And also sometimes they would even chip the stuff away themselves by peeling the polish off. And in a way, this visual kind of helps infantilize her the way that Howard does, but in a much less creepy way. I mean, it's showing us time passage, and it is also as he continues to basically treat her like a little girl, her nail polish also kind of shows that off as well. This is a really great movie, and I definitely recommend people check this movie out. It's only really in the last 10 or 15 minutes that you have any kind of indication that there's a whole other monster movie going on outside the bunker. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. Next week, we're going north of the border to Canada for a treat as we check out a spooky werewolf film with Emily Perkins and Catherine Isabel starring in Ginger Snaps. Until next week, stay spooky.